A racist landlord decides to evict a hard-working black family from their home, convinced that they don't belong in his property. With cruel words and discriminatory actions, he makes their lives difficult until the shocking moment when he learns their true identity. What happens next will leave you speechless. Karma hits hard when the landlord finds out that the family he tried to push out is far more powerful than he could ever imagine. Stay tuned to see how this unbelievable twist unfolds and teaches a valuable lesson in respect, equality, and the consequences of prejudice. The morning sun had barely risen when the doorbell rang with an unsettling urgency. Standing at the door was the landlord, a man with an air of arrogance that was impossible to ignore. His eyes scanned the modest apartment, judging every corner of it as if it didn't deserve to exist in the neighborhood he owned. Without a greeting, he stepped forward, his tone harsh. "I need you to pack your things. You're out," he said flatly, his words cutting through the stillness of the home. The family inside had barely processed the intrusion. They had been paying rent on time for years, keeping to themselves, quietly working to build a life. But none of that seemed to matter now. The landlord, convinced of his superiority, was there to enforce his will. "You can't do this," came the firm response, but his face remained unreadable, his stance unyielding. "I can do whatever I want. You people don't belong here. You're disrupting my building." His words were sharp and laced with bias, an all-too-familiar tone that oozed disrespect and entitlement. As he stood in the doorway, the family members exchanged confused and hurt glances, struggling to process the reality of being treated like this. This wasn't just about eviction. It was about something deeper, about prejudice and a sense of power that had been misused. With one last look at the home he deemed unworthy, the landlord handed them an eviction notice. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the hall. The door closed with a thud, leaving a painful silence in its wake. The family stood still for a moment, processing the cruelty they had just faced. It wasn't just an eviction. It was a blatant display of racism, an unjust action that would soon lead to an unexpected twist. The family stood in stunned silence, staring at the eviction notice in their hands. It was impossible to believe what had just happened. They had done everything right, paid their rent on time, kept the apartment in good condition, and quietly minded their business. But now, they were being forced out of their home for no reason other than the color of their skin. "Why?" one of them finally asked, breaking the silence. It was a question that lingered in the air, heavy with pain. How could someone treat another human being like this? The landlord had given no explanation, no justification for his actions. He had simply barged in and made it clear that they didn't belong there, as if they were nothing more than a nuisance to him. The family felt the sting of his words, but more than anything, they felt the weight of his racism. The man had walked away so easily, as though they were just another problem to be discarded. But for the family, this wasn't just about losing their home. It was about the deep injustice they had just encountered. And while they didn't fully understand why it was happening, they knew it was something they couldn't let go. They decided to fight back, even if they didn't know how. There had to be something they could do to prove their worth, not just to the landlord, but to the world. They weren't just the victims of some random eviction. They were hard-working, good people who had every right to live where they had made a home. The first few calls to the local authorities yielded little. It was clear that the landlord, with his power and status, could get away with things others couldn't. But the more they searched for solutions, the more they realized they weren't alone. They found an advocate who listened, a lawyer who saw the injustice for what it was. With each step, the family felt a spark of hope reignite. They might not have control over their immediate situation, but they weren't going to let the landlord's behavior stand without consequence. As they prepared to take action, they slowly began to piece together the landlord's true character. They learned that he had been involved in multiple discriminatory practices in the past, but no one had ever dared to challenge him. His wealth and power had allowed him to act with impunity, pushing people around without fear of retaliation, but that was about to change. One day, while gathering information, the family discovered something that shook them to their core. The landlord, a man who had treated them as if they were nothing, was not who he claimed to be. His business dealings were murky, and his financial dealings were far more complicated than they had ever imagined. They learned that he had ties to an influential network, but not the kind of ties that could protect him forever. His reputation, already built on questionable practices, was on the verge of crumbling. What the family didn't know at the time was that their own identity held a key piece of the puzzle. They were more connected than anyone realized. And the connections they had were about to turn the tables on the arrogant landlord who thought he could destroy their lives without consequences. They had a chance to fight back, not just for their home, but for justice. But to do so, they needed to fully understand who they were dealing with, and they were determined to take every step necessary to expose the truth. Meanwhile, the landlord, fully confident in his position, continued with his life. Oblivious to the fact that his actions were setting in motion a series of events that would soon lead to his downfall, he continued his routine, convinced that the family would simply leave and forget about everything. The power dynamics seemed in his favor, and the idea that anyone would challenge him seemed laughable. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As the family dug deeper into the landlord's background, they discovered more than just financial irregularities. They uncovered a history of shady business deals, unlawful evictions, and a growing trail of victims. They learned that the landlord had been hiding a lot more than he was willing to admit, and they were determined to bring those secrets to light. What they didn't expect was the revelation that was about to hit the landlord like a ton of bricks, a twist that would change everything. The family wasn't just fighting for their home. They were fighting to expose a truth that would bring the landlord's empire to its knees. And soon, the powerful man who thought he could get away with racism would realize just how wrong he was. The day of reckoning arrived faster than the landlord could have ever anticipated. The family, now with their lawyer's help, had been gathering evidence and preparing to take action. They weren't just going to accept what had happened, they were ready to fight. What they hadn't anticipated was how quickly everything would unravel for the landlord. It all started with a simple letter, one that would expose the landlord's years of shady business practices. The family's lawyer had done the unthinkable. He had uncovered the landlord's deepest, darkest secrets. There were rumors about financial fraud, illegal evictions, and even threats made to previous tenants, but no one had dared challenge him before. Now, the family was about to bring all of it to light. The landlord was still oblivious to what was coming. He had assumed that, as always, the poor family would simply pack up and leave without a fight. He hadn't expected that they would uncover the truth about his real identity, about how his wealth had been built not on hard work, but on manipulation, exploitation, and unlawful practices. The family, armed with new knowledge, confronted the landlord one final time. They stood at the threshold of his office, the place where he had made countless decisions that hurt people without a second thought. The atmosphere in the room was tense, charged with an energy that neither of them had expected. "Mr. Grayson," the family's lawyer began, his voice calm but authoritative. "We've uncovered a few things about your business dealings. You've made a lot of money off the backs of families like mine. And now it's time for you to face the consequences." The landlord, sitting behind his large mahogany desk, raised an eyebrow. He leaned back in his chair, his smug expression still intact. "What are you talking about? I have nothing to hide." The lawyer slid a stack of documents across the desk. The pages detailed a history of his underhanded dealings, from exploiting tenants to falsifying legal documents to increase his profits. "These are just the beginning," the lawyer said, his eyes never leaving the landlord. "We have proof of everything you've been doing, and we're taking this to the authorities." For the first time, the landlord's expression faltered. His face drained of color, and he sat up straighter in his chair, the calm demeanor slipping away. "You can't do this," he hissed, trying to regain his composure. "I'll have you all thrown out." But it was too late. The family had already contacted the media, and the lawyer had sent the evidence to the right people. The truth was out. The landlord's actions, his exploitation of vulnerable tenants, and his deep-seated racism were now public knowledge. The pressure had mounted, and there was no way to undo what had been set in motion. Within hours, the news broke. Headlines exploded with the story of the landlord's fraudulent activities. The public was outraged. The community rallied around the family, offering support, and local officials, who had turned a blind eye for years, now found themselves under intense scrutiny. The landlord's business, once thriving, began to crumble. Tenants who had been too afraid to speak up came forward with their own stories, exposing his mistreatment and abuse of power. Legal actions were taken against him, and soon he was forced to face the repercussions of his actions. His empire of properties, built on lies and exploitation, started to collapse. And then came the most crushing blow. An investigation into his personal wealth revealed that much of it was gained through illegal means. His assets were frozen, his businesses seized, and his name was tarnished forever. What had once been a man who felt invincible was now a man who could barely escape the consequences of his own greed. As the landlord's world unraveled, he couldn't help but realize how deeply he had underestimated the family he had tried to evict. He had thought they were weak, that they were powerless against him. But in the end, it was his own arrogance and racism that had led to his downfall. The family, meanwhile, had already moved on. They had secured a new home, thanks to the support of their community and the newfound recognition of their fight. They had faced adversity head-on, and they had emerged victorious. What's more, they had done it with grace, dignity, and a belief in what was right. They hadn't let the landlord's hate or prejudice define them, and in the end, their resilience had triumphed. The moment the landlord had tried to push them out of their home, he hadn't just triggered their fight for justice. He had set into motion the karma that would eventually undo everything he had built. It was a lesson he would never forget. His actions, driven by hate and arrogance, would always catch up to him. And the family, whose strength he had tried to break, would be the ones to expose his wrongdoings. The landlord's world continued to spiral out of control. What started as a simple act of eviction had triggered a chain reaction of events that he couldn't stop. The media coverage surrounding his illegal business practices and racist treatment of tenants was relentless. People in the community, once too afraid to speak out, began sharing their own stories of mistreatment. The revelations about his shady dealings were more damaging than anyone had expected. But the worst was yet to come. It wasn't just the public backlash or the legal troubles that had begun to erode his empire. As the landlord sat in his now empty office, trying to come to terms with the mess he had created, he received a phone call. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but the words that followed left him speechless. "I'm afraid your assets have been frozen. The authorities are seizing your properties, and you are facing criminal charges," the voice explained. Stanley Grayson's breath caught in his throat. His once thriving business was now a shell of its former self, with debts mounting and the threat of jail looming. The weight of his actions began to sink in. He had been so sure that his wealth, status, and connections would protect him. He had never thought that a black family he had so callously evicted would turn his world upside down. And yet, here he was, losing everything. But there was one final twist. One that would ensure the landlord's shame would be permanent. It was then that he discovered who the family really was. The family he had tried to evict wasn't just another tenant struggling to make ends meet. The father, who had been so humble and hardworking, was a key figure in a high-profile nonprofit organization dedicated to housing rights and social justice. The mother, who had worked tirelessly as a nurse, had secretly been a major advocate for tenant rights in their community, helping countless people escape unfair evictions and poor living conditions. They weren't just any family. They were powerful figures in the fight for justice. Stanley's realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had unknowingly targeted a family that had been working to improve the lives of people in his very buildings. He had assumed they were just another low-income family who would quietly move out. But in doing so, he had picked the wrong people to mess with. The family's connections, their network of powerful allies in legal, social, and political circles, had come together to expose everything Stanley had tried to hide. As the landlord's business continued to crumble, the final revelation came. The family had been using their platform and resources to mobilize and take legal action, targeting landlords like Stanley who mistreated their tenants. Their reputation in the community made them untouchable, and they used that power not to gain more wealth, but to fight for justice. But the landlord wasn't the only one affected. The ripple effects of his actions spread far beyond just his business. Local authorities, who had turned a blind eye to his misconduct for years, were now under pressure to answer for their own failure to regulate the landlord's practices. Investigations were launched into his entire portfolio of properties. His name, once synonymous with wealth and power, became a symbol of racism, greed, and exploitation. The community began to rally behind the family, offering them support in the form of donations, legal aid, and even offers for a new home. What had been an eviction that was meant to humiliate and push them out of the community had turned into a symbol of strength, resilience, and justice. For the landlord, the moment of realization that he had evicted a family so deeply connected to the fight for justice was the final blow. His arrogance and prejudice had cost him everything: his wealth, his reputation, his businesses, and his freedom. And in the end, it was his own racism that had set in motion his downfall. The family, on the other hand, emerged stronger than ever. They didn't just win their fight to stay in their home. They had exposed a larger issue of housing discrimination, and their victory would ripple across the city, forcing changes in the system that had allowed landlords like Stanley to exploit vulnerable tenants for so long. They didn't need to retaliate with anger or violence. They fought back with truth, resilience, and the power of their identity. As the landlord's empire collapsed, the family walked away victorious, their strength and unity serving as a reminder that no amount of money or privilege could ever stop justice from prevailing. The landlord's empire was in ruins. The properties that once stood as symbols of his wealth were now in the hands of those who had been wronged by his exploitation. His business, built on manipulation and prejudice, was now a collection of legal cases, accusations, and public outrage. The family he had tried to evict, the very people he had sought to belittle and cast aside, had brought him to his knees. But it wasn't just the loss of his assets that hurt. It was the fact that his own actions had exposed him for who he truly was. Stanley Grayson, once untouchable in his wealth and arrogance, had now been reduced to a cautionary tale. His arrogance had cost him everything. The same entitlement that had once propelled him forward now stood as a glaring flaw in his character. He had assumed that by using his power, he could break the will of the family, force them out of their home without consequence. What he didn't realize was that his actions had not only sparked a chain of events that led to his downfall, but had also ignited a movement of support for those he had wronged. While the landlord was left to deal with his growing legal battles, the family stood tall, their dignity unshaken by the treatment they had endured. They didn't need to seek revenge or bask in the failure of their oppressor. They had already won. Their victory wasn't just in securing their home. It was in showing the world that justice, no matter how long it takes, always has a way of finding its path. With their victory, the family was able to help other tenants who had been exploited by Stanley and others like him. Their lawyer, who had fought alongside them from the beginning, became an advocate for tenant rights in the community, working with local organizations to address housing discrimination. What had seemed like an isolated case of injustice had turned into a powerful movement that would change the course of local housing laws and protections. As the landlord's reputation continued to fall apart, he found himself struggling to regain any sort of control over his life. His properties were now in the hands of the city, and the tenants he had once taken advantage of were now legally protected from his grasp. The community that had once respected him now saw him for what he truly was, a man who used his privilege and wealth to oppress others. Through it all, the family remained strong. They found a new place to live, one that was far from the place where their lives had been turned upside down. They continued to build their lives, not just for themselves, but for others who needed to see what true justice and resilience looked like. They became local heroes, not for the fame or recognition, but for their unwavering fight for fairness and respect. In the aftermath of the landlord's fall from grace, the family did not celebrate his downfall. Instead, they used the platform they had earned to bring attention to the systemic issues that allowed people like Stanley to thrive, while families like theirs were forced to fight for their rights. They spoke at rallies, joined community organizing efforts, and continued their work to ensure that the next family wouldn't have to go through what they had. The landlord, on the other hand, learned the hard way that his wealth and status could not shield him from the consequences of his actions. His fall was swift and unforgiving, but in the grand scheme of things, his punishment was just. The ripple effects of his decisions were felt throughout the community, but they were also a reminder of the power of standing up for what's right. As the days passed, Stanley found himself facing more than just financial ruin. He had lost the respect of those who once supported him, and the once mighty landlord was now an outcast, shunned by the very community he had tried to dominate. He realized too late that respect could not be bought. It had to be earned through fairness, kindness, and integrity, things he had never truly understood. The family, on the other hand, emerged from the ordeal stronger than ever. The experience had brought them closer together, reaffirming their belief in the importance of love, unity, and standing up for justice. They had endured hardship, but they had also become a beacon of hope for others. Their story became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the idea that no matter how powerful someone may be, the truth and justice will always prevail. As the landlord faced the consequences of his actions, the family knew that this was more than just a personal victory. It was a victory for every person who had been unjustly treated, a reminder that no matter how powerful or influential someone might be, their actions would eventually catch up to them. Karma, in the end, was always on the side of justice. The story of the landlord's fall and the family's triumph serves as a powerful reminder of the impact of prejudice and the strength it takes to stand up for what's right. The landlord, once at the top of his game, learned the hard way that treating others with cruelty and arrogance only leads to destruction. The family, on the other hand, showed the world the power of resilience and unity in the face of adversity. They didn't just fight for their home, they fought for the dignity and respect that everyone deserves. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed or faced injustice, and how did you respond? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories. If this story inspired you, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales that highlight justice, resilience, and the importance of standing up against discrimination. Let's continue spreading messages of equality, dignity, and respect for all. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video, where we explore more inspiring stories that remind us of the strength in unity and the power of justice.